One of the interesting things about The 1001 Nights that it's a collection of stories without an author. There are so many people who contributed to the creation of 1001 Nights, and scholars have been trying to figure out how this collection emerged, how it came together. So there are 1001 Nights. How many stories are there?
Well, it would take about 200 stories to make up the 1001 Nights. You've got to remember it cannot be one story per night. If Scheherazade actually finished a story per night, she would not live 2 nights.
Right.
She needs the cliffhangers, much as Goethe's mother perhaps needed them as well. So there probably was never a single complete version of the 1001 Nights. New scholarship is changing the way that we think about the nights. The title itself was more of an aspiration and was more of a promise than a description. 1001, if 1,000 is almost like near infinity, 1001 was a way of saying endless.
Countless stories.
Countless stories. Every scribe was probably confronted by a limited set of tales, nowhere near enough tales. So maybe 40 stories, not 200. Maybe 270 or 280 nights, as we have in the most reliable manuscript, the Galan manuscript, not 1001 nights.
Who is Galan and what is that mysterious manuscript?
Antoine Galan happens to be the first European translator of the 1001 Nights, widely credited as a sort of literary author of the Arabian Nights, bringing the Nights to the realm of literature.
And this is the early 18th century,
In
right?
the early 18th century. And it so happens by chance, the manuscript he was able to procure from his contacts in the Middle East has proven to be the most authentic and reliable manuscript that we have. But as I was suggesting, it's partial. It does not include anything close to 1001 Nights of storytelling. Scheherazade would have died in tale 282 or so, more or less. We imagine he was missing volumes, but as I was saying, maybe we don't know. Maybe it's more likely that the so-called missing volumes never really existed. Every scribe has confronted that fundamental problem. How do I bridge this gap between this shorter body of tales I have in front of me and the title, which promises endless stories?
And so what did they do?
Well, they cut and paste, and the latest research indicates that they often had other story collections that they borrowed from. And if you were in Istanbul or in Cairo or Damascus, you might be compiling a different set of stories. So we have many different canons of 1001 Nights. And sometimes the stories would be borrowed almost in roughly the same sequence as they occurred in another story collection.
So this is how we can track them to a different story collection because it's the same stories in a similar sequence.
In a similar sequence.
Okay.
This is new work by a French scholar, Abu Bakr Shahibi, just exploding our notion of what the Arabian Nights is. We imagined we had about 20 manuscripts and printed editions of the Nights from which we could do a modern critical edition, which is what Professor Muhsin Mahdi did here at Harvard in 1984, a scholarly modern edition, the first one ever of the 1001 Nights.
And how many stories does that include?
About 280.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the largest canon of stories. Are these the most authentic ones?
Well, these stories, they have a certain coherence and consistency.
Okay.
And they do seem to belong together. You know, they're often referred to as the original cycle or the original nucleus of stories. And I think there is a certain payoff to thinking of them in that way. Scheherazade is telling stories to save her life. These are often stories of characters who find themselves in a similar predicament. And the very first story that Scheherazade tells, Shahryar, is the story of the merchant and the genie. And it so happens that immediately characters are telling stories to save their own lives. There's a close interweaving and resonance between the embedded tales and the framing narrative in this original cycle of tales. And after that, when our scribes in Istanbul or Cairo or Damascus were cutting and pasting, or in Baghdad, they were adding stories to the corpus of the 1001 Nights. They did not necessarily always have that instinct to go back and think, okay, so how is this connecting to Shahrazade's dynamic in Shahryar? Why would it make sense for her to tell this particular story? The original stories, we can almost pretend that they were written by the same author, though that's highly unlikely to have been the case.
So we have that inner core, that first cycle that's sort of thematically connected. Then we have all these scribes filling in the gaps or adding to them in various ways. And this is now what scholars too are trying to track down where these stories come from. And
That's
this is
right.
also part of your own research, right? Can you tell us about
Yes,
that?
well, because I would say that the translators of the 1001 Nights are often accused of being forgers, and Muhsin Mahdi, who did the critical edition, who cut the stories from 1001 Nights down to 280, from 200 stories to 40. He describes the work of the translators like Galan as the grime that you have to remove, you know. So using the metaphor of art restoration, I have to cut that gunk out that has accumulated over the Thousand and One Nights.
To get the pure original.
To get the pure
core.
original. And he's probably gone a bit too far, imagining a kind of ur-text or sort of preternatural, elemental text of the Thousand and One Nights. Given what we know now about the scribes were already editors. They were already making choices as to what to include. I think the translators simply performed a very similar role. They had, as the case of Antoine Galland, only 280 or so stories, and he needed the income from translating. He had been very wealthy and very well connected in his youth, but he was translating these stories as an old man, and he needed more stories, and he did what the scribes did. He found them elsewhere.
And where?
The most famous stories that Galland added to the Thousand and One Nights are the so-called orphan tales, which have no Arabic original. And these include tales like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp.
So some of the most famous ones are not in the original core of Arabic tales.
Exactly. The most seminal, the most influential, not only in literature, not only in the writing of writers from Byron to Joyce, but also Mahfouz and Pamuk. These are stories that were added in the French translation. But also these are stories that have influenced film, for example. The Thief of Baghdad, seminal works of early European cinema were influenced by these stories.